Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to today's lore video on Azhag, the Slaughterer, or Azhag, or Azhag, or whatever the hell you wish to call them. Again, Games Workshop usually has a wide variety of interpretation of their names. Hell, I like buying audiobooks to the 40k Horus Heresy, and I've heard about 7 different pronunciations of Gulliman so far, so, yeah. Your guess is as good as mine, considering that none of us speak Orcish, sadly. So, before we can really talk about Azhag, we need to talk about the Crown of Sorcery, because Azhag himself is not really all that in control of his actions. He is possessed, you could probably say, by this wonderful headpiece. Now, the Crown of Sorcery, sometimes referred to as the Crown of Nagash, is a magical crown or circlet, depending on a little bit when you're reading it and the fluff, and it was made by the great necromancer Nagash around 1300 before Imperial calendar in his fortress of Nagajizar in Crippled Peak. This was before the furry lovelies that are the Skavens assassinated the poor bastard. The Crown of Sorcery was originally intended as a boost to Nagash's own power. He infused it with the slightest portion of his will and his malice, and has essentially turned it into a bit of a notebook. Whenever he's reciting a spell, etc., the crown will tell him what is next, what was before, what is the purpose, etc., etc. It is essentially kind of a magical guidebook, way more fancy than an iPhone, but I'm assuming ever so slightly more heavy on the soul. A downside of this is the fact that when Nagash is not the one using it, it has a nasty tendency of whispering other naughty things into their minds, bending them slowly to its will. Now, it is not entirely clear if that will is the will of Nagash, or if the crown, when parted from its master, has some kind of will of its own. It's a little bit unclear because the actions of the various people that have taken possession of the crown before Azhag, well, they haven't really seemed to carry out Nagash's agenda. If anything, you would think that agenda would be to get to Cripple Peak and help Nagash piece himself together after having been murdered and violated by the Skaven, but that hasn't really seemed to have happened, so it seems fair to assume that the crown might just have an agenda of its own. So, I mentioned various different owners. The owners of the crown have, pretty much all of them gotten corrupted, but it has had more than one. Now, of course, Nagash was the first, but after the death of Nagash at the hands of one of the kings of Khemri, the king Al-Shadizar, to be more precise, the king picked up the crown and carried it along with him to his final resting place. He wandered into the blind river in the Badlands and was washed downstream, and was later discovered by Caden, a young human shaman. He took the crown because, well, shiny, and he went on to found the city of Morkine, and later, with the assistance of the vampire Usharon, the miniature empire, or actually not that small even, of Strigoi. Now, as for the history of Strigoi, that's something we're not going to get into too much here, but it's a rather interesting one, as, the Strigoi have always been known as monsters, cruel, beastly creatures, but at the very least, to begin with, they were certainly worshippers of necromancy and followers of death cults and such on things, but they weren't necessarily evil, or at the very least that's how the lore suggests it. But after a time, the city and its people were destroyed in a greenskin wag in retaliation for, well, the newfound Empire of Strigoi pushing them out of their ancestral homes in the Badlands. Quite the feat in and of itself, but it sadly did not last. Escaping the destruction of his city, Morkine escaped with the crown, and the crown was later passed on to Morath, who was then defeated by Sigeman, with Sigmar taking the crown. Sigmar, however, was not stupid enough to put the thing on his head, and locked it away. Although it was to turn out that hiding things was not one of Sigmar's many, many talents, although he did manage to hide it in a somewhat unexpected area. You see, he managed to hide it off somewhere in the Troll country, which is impressive in and of itself, as that's usually not a place you would expect to find any centers of human population, and yet the warlord Azhag, they was wandering the troll lands, but apparently bit off a little bit more than he could chew and was chased underground into the ancient ruins of the human city of Tortheim, or Death City, essentially. Very subtle, I know. Of course, a place with such a name is usually not entirely friendly, and Azhag and his bunch of boys had to fight their way through quite the bunch of demonic monstrosities and undead and all manners of other nonsense that lived in the city, eventually killing a multi-headed chaos troll after a fierce battle. Azhag did indeed get out on top in this particular fight, and amidst the bone-strewn lair of the chaos troll was, you guessed it, the crown of sorcery, and Azhag, not being quite as intelligent as the good old Sigma, decided, well, this is very shiny, let's put it on me head, at which point he immediately started to, get rather informed, let's just say. The crown, having found someone that was not particularly intelligent, relatively quickly started exerting his influence. Whereas in the event of its former human owner, it had to be a little bit subtle about it because it was a human magic user and would therefore be somewhat alarmed if his headpiece suddenly started talking to him. Having attached himself to an orc, however, well, subtlety was not at the top of the crown's list of priorities at the time, and Azhag himself, well, shit, my new headpiece is talking to me. Awesome! It's telling me the way out of these ruins past all of the horrible monsters, and it's telling me how to kick more ass. Well, I don't really see any backside in this particular story, so sure, fine, I'll accept this. And that's pretty much the story. Now, of course, the crown also had a nasty habit of wanting to do things that weren't particularly orky, like, you know, applying things like tactics or strategy to campaign to the battlefield. Decidedly un-orcish stuff, and Azhag disapproved of this weakling nonsense, and so what the crown at first thought to be a very simple and easily manipulated orc, a very easy-to-use mount, so to say, turned out to be a little bit more complicated as the crown got ever more insidious. The orc fought back with never-ending amounts of sheer good old-fashioned brute stupidity, which the crown found hard to match. Eventually it had to resort to slightly more forceful methods, but we'll get to that in a bit. Having donned his new headpiece/magical iPhone, Azhag found his way, in no small part due to said magical headpiece, out of the labyrinthian ruins of Tortenberg, and back up to the surface, where he, or, well, they, I suppose I should say, decided that, you know what, let's start gathering an army, shall we, because that is usually pretty amusing, and so they headed back into the Badlands to see if they couldn't do some good old-fashioned orc diplomacy. This is where the crown really started to show its, shine, seeing as Azhag's usually somewhat brutal and limited mind was now honed to a razor's edge by the crown. He was now capable of making actual tactical and strategic decisions beyond, well, those guys are a slightly different color than my guys, so wag! Essentially. In some cases, of course, the crown's tactical and strategic acumen might be somewhat limited by the limitations of his host, but in this case, he had attached himself to a gigantic orc warboss who had more than enough oomph to back up the crown's brains. This winning combination quite quickly, in fact, subjugated the majority of orcish tribes in the Darklands, and began attracting followers from more distant areas, amongst others the night goblins, who brought him a wonderful giant man-eating wyvern, or in this case goblin and orc-eating wyvern. Now, in the vast majority of cases, read virtually all, a wyvern cannot be reared as a mount, even for an orc, without having been hand-reared from an egg. Now, bear in mind that even a so-called loyal Wyvern is only loyal so long as it can't find a way to eat its rider, so, you know, loyalty is very subjective in a term in this particular case. However, this was not a hand-reared Wyvern. As such, you would assume that Azhag would have a pretty hard time subjugating it, except at this point Azhag was no normal orc, was he, with the crown of Nagash upon his head, and subjugated the Wyvern with nothing but a, and I am quoting directly from the lore here, hard stare. So, if you ever wondered about what all that so-called eye rape the feminists are on about, well, that's pretty much it, except greener. Having gained the quote-unquote loyalty of his new companion, Skull Muncher, wonderfully charming name by the way, Azhag had done pretty much everything he could do and should do in the Northern Darklands at this point, and so he and the Crown decided it was time to head south. Because, you see, this is where some of the contrasting stories come into play. Because, as mentioned earlier, the Crown had been hanging around in the human kingdom of Strigoi for quite a while without really bothering to do anything. Now, this could be potentially because it was relatively close by to Nagash's crippled peak, or maybe because there was a vampire around to try and, you know, subjugate its will a little bit. These are all potential excuses, but at that time, the Crown didn't really seem all that interested in returning to Nagash, as he wasn't even that far away, technically speaking. Well, at this point he was essentially a bunch of ash, but, you know, technically speaking, he was still alive, quote-unquote, and the Crown would have wanted to go back to him, but however, it didn't, despite the fact that it was pretty damn close, and it had, well, an army at its command. I mean, there's no reason why it would not have headed to Cripple Peak, or told its new bearer to head to Cripple Peak, if it had that much of an agenda of its own. However, now we are told in the Azhag's backstory that the Crown wished to reunite with its master. However, again, Azhag did waste a lot of time before heading south, so I'm honestly not entirely sure about this one. I think I'm just going to say that the Crown certainly has a certain amount of its own will. It has an agenda of its own. That agenda is it wants to go back to its master and be reunited with his full power, because essentially it is just a smaller shard of Nagash, and as such it cannot gain its true power without Nagash. However, on the other hand, the Crown is clearly not overly hurried about this particular goal. Now, you could also argue that it doesn't have that much of an influence over its bearer, which would be true, except for the fact that, you know, it takes years upon years upon years for the Crown to even plant the suggestion of wouldn't you please head north into the head of someone who seems to be more than willing to listen when it tells him about strategic and tactical maneuvers, you know? It seems a bit odd that it couldn't just go like, oi, dubshit, south, now. But, nevertheless, at this point in time, Azhag suddenly found out that he wanted to head south out of the Darklands northern part, and as such, well, he had to go through the Empire, didn't he? Which leads us to his adventures in the Empire. To begin with, he crossed the mountains back in the general direction of Kislev, because, well, it's one of the few passes you can actually cross without being, you know, grimgore and insane. He then started heading south, where he displayed a cunning that was quite unfamiliar to the Empire when it comes to his species. In fact, this is how he gained his title, the Slaughterer. It was, more specifically, at the Battle of Butcher's Hill, where after carrying out a rather surprising, by Empire standard, pincer maneuver, he managed to catch a large Imperial army that had been sent northwards to stop him, pretty much wiping it out completely, which is not something the Empire was entirely used to, to say the absolute least. Most orc raids into the Empire are relatively short-lived affairs, as once they can be brought to battle effectively, the Empire usually don't have that much trouble stopping them, as most orcs are somewhat limited in their strategic possibilities, usually consisting of a run screaming towards the enemy. This was, however, as we have already discussed, not Azhag's MO, and in those occasions where he could not simply outmaneuver and outthink the enemy, well, he's still a massive orc warlord that uses death magic, so yeah, he was pretty dangerous in melee as well, as you can imagine, and made a bit of a habit out of essentially singling out enemy leaders and then bum-rushing them on top of his wyvern and chopping them into tiny little pieces, which was a pretty damn effective strategy. However, there was one small problem. You see, Azhag, being an orc, didn't really want to take the quickest way southwards and wanted to wander off and have a fight with random local farmers, raiding villages, stealing piglets and all kinds of other orcish nonsense. The Crown did not approve of this at all, and it redoubled its effort to take control over Azhag's mind. Now, again, it seems a little bit odd that it chose this particular moment to start mentally dueling with his orc bearer instead of, doing it back in the Darklands, where it would be relatively safe, but nevertheless, this is where we found ourselves. So, every time Azhag would do something stupid, the Crown would essentially mind-fry him for a little bit and bitch yell at him. This turned out to be a less than winning strategy, as it left Azhag in a stupor. He would essentially just stand there for hours on end, staring blankly into nowhere, while he was fighting a mental battle with his Crown. Now, as you might imagine, a few of the orc boys figured that this was ever so slightly erratic behaviour, and it wasn't quite normal, but being orcs, they didn't really give that much of a shit about it because, well, Azhag had left them to all kinds of battles, and he'd won, so meh. He might be insane, but shit it, he can actually win battles. So they didn't really have any issues with following him anywhere, despite the fact that he was clearly ever so slightly, bonkers. However, this was to manifest itself in one slightly more problematic manner as well, however, as during a period of Azhag's control, he once again deviated from the Crown's intended path, wandering directly into the path of an Imperial army. This was then later to become known as the Battle of Osterwald. Now, during the majority of this battle, the Crown did not have proper control of Azhag, as such it couldn't really carry out any fancy strategies. It was, however, a very, very close-fought battle, just because at this point the Orc army was bloody massive. Azhag also rushed straight into the heart of the enemy army, heading for its leader, the Grand Master of the Knights Panther, one Werner von Kriegstald. Now, this would normally not have been that big of a problem, he's surrounded by Knights Panther, but he's a massive fuck-off orc warlord with magical abilities riding a giant wyvern. He can probably take care of himself. However, the Crown was getting really, really pissy with Azhag and his constant stupidity, and decided this would be a really good time to start brain-zapping him. Now, you can probably imagine that trying to fight a battle against half a dozen Knights Panthers is not made easier by the fact that your headpiece is randomly going bzz, bzz into your skull. This proved fatal, as one might suspect, giving the Grandmaster just the opening he needed to finally put Azhag down. Now, this, of course, had somewhat devastating effects on his army, because up until this point, they had pretty much been reliant entirely upon Azhag and his scheming, his plans, his strategies. Now, suddenly leaderless and with no plan, they found themselves right in front of a massive Empire army, and they broke and ran pretty much immediately. Luckily for the Empire, however, Werner von Kriegstald was not the only person around. The Grand Theogonist of the Cult of Sigmar was also accompanying the army, and immediately recognized that this was no normal headpiece, and stopped, in pretty much the last moment, the Grandmaster from claiming it for himself. Recognizing not entirely what this was, but that it certainly was rather powerful, and it must have had some kind of effect upon the Orc, which would explain his somewhat un-orcish behaviour, the Grand Theogonist demanded that the crown be relinquished to his authority, whereupon it was taken back to the capital city of Altdorf and was placed in the deepest, darkest vaults beneath the Cathedral of Sigeman. From then on, the ancient crown has since been guarded eternally by both the ever-vigilant clergy of Sigma and the powers of the vault's ancient magical wards, pretty damn considerable wards as well, and this is where we start deviating into end times nonsense, so I'll be stopping it there. Until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching this lore video on Azhag the Slaughterer, and I do hope to see you soon. Have a good day.